the Volcker shock, movements in the real rate of interest, U.S. and France, 1960 to 2001. What's the real rate of interest? Anybody know? Well, what's nominal interest? We need some econ majors in the room. No econ majors in the room? You go to the bank, you put a bunch of money in the bank, and you ask them what's the interest rate. And these days they tell you it's 0.1% or something like that, right? In the past, it might have been 3% or even maybe 4 or 5%. And that's the amount of interest they pay you for letting them hold your money. Of course, they don't just hold your money, they actually play with it. They use it. The money you give them is money that they can then turn around and lend to people at interest. And they can charge interest on those loans. And they make money from that interest. Well, the idea is that if you lent them the money, you deserve some cut of what they can make with that money. And that's why they pay you interest. But that's just the nominal rate. The real rate of interest is the nominal rate minus inflation. The inflation rate is a measure of how your money is losing value over time. So if you put $10 million in the bank and they're paying you 3% interest, but the inflation rate is also 3%, at the end of some period of time, like a year, you'll have more money in nominal terms, but it will be worth the same amount as it was when you started. This climb here, or this drop, I'm sorry, here, in the mid-1970s, is negative real interest, which is to say inflation was higher than interest rates, which is to say that if you had $10 million in the bank, you might be making 4 or 5% in interest on it, but inflation was 7 or 8%. You were losing money with each passing second. Harvey pulls this out to emphasize how much of a threat this posed to people with large amounts of money, with large amounts of wealth. This was a phenomenon in which macroeconomic processes were essentially reducing the wealth of the people who owned capital simply with the passage of time. And you can imagine that this is not something that makes the people with a lot of wealth very happy. This is the economic threat that was faced in the 1970s by people with lots of money. You combine that with the political threat that they felt from people in the streets, the threat of communism, the Cold War, and you get the circumstances of the 1970s, which Harvey is suggesting gave rise to neoliberalism as a political economic philosophy and response to these circumstances. Are there any questions? Let's take a 5-minute break. Okay. So, and by the way, David Harvey gave a lecture last week at the conference in Washington, D.C., and he made the case that the current financial crisis, what we have seen in the last, say, year and a half, 2 years, he explained it. His analysis of the current financial crisis was as a consequence, it is a consequence of the changes that were made in the 1970s in response to this crisis. That what was done to sort of address the crisis in the 1970s set the pieces in place for the crisis that we've experienced in the last couple of years. One of the things he said about the 1970s was that labor was excessively strong relative to capital and in the eyes of capital, and that the 1970s and neoliberalism were a response to that strength of labor. In any case, going back to his treatment in his book from several years ago, we can interpret neoliberalization either as a utopian project to realize a theoretical design for the reorganization of international capitalism, or as a political project to reestablish the conditions for capital accumulation and to restore the power of economic elites. The utopian part he's referring to is this faith in free markets to solve all problems, and even the faith that there is such a thing as a free market. He argues that the free market is actually a utopian idea, insofar as every market, in order to operate, has got to have certain rules of the road, so to speak, particularly things like currencies, that are unavoidably about political processes, states, government, that kind of thing. To that extent, the idea of a free market somehow disconnected from political processes is utopian. But here he's going to focus on the political project of neoliberalism. He's going to suggest that the utopian project, because it's a utopian project, can never really be achieved. But the political project, he suggests, was quite successful. Neoliberalization has not been very effective in revitalizing global capital accumulation, he says, but it has succeeded remarkably well in restoring, or in some instances, as in Russia and China, creating the power of an economic elite. The theoretical utopianism of neoliberal argument has, I conclude, primarily worked as a system of justification and legitimation for whatever needed to be done to achieve this goal. So his analysis of global capitalism since the 1970s is that it hasn't really solved the problem of increasing accumulation itself, but it has achieved the goal of redistributing wealth back into the hands of an elite and undermining the relatively equitable distribution of wealth that was found circa 1973. And to illustrate this, he summoned some data. The restoration of class power share in national income of the top 0.1% of the population, US, Britain, and France, 1913 to 1998. So now we're talking about 1/10 of 1% of the population. How much income does this select group receive? Share as a percentage of the entire national income. And you can see the United States is the solid dark dots, France is the triangles, United Kingdom is the circles. You can see that in prior to the Depression, the top 1/10 of 1% received about 10% of all national income. This declined steadily until by the end of World War II, it was a mere 2 to 4%. It continued to decline into the 1970s, down to just 1% in the United Kingdom, about 2% in the US and France. And you can see that after the mid-1980s, it begins to climb again. And the United States is particularly pronounced in this. It's back up to 6% by 1998. I'm not sure what the latest figures are, but I'm quite confident that they're in fact higher than that. So this is just a simple, description or measurement of inequality in terms of income. Here we have pay of CEOs according to their rank in the hierarchy, the 10th, 50th, and 100th. So this is the pay rank of the 10 highest paid CEOs. This is a logarithmic scale, and you can see that the increase has been quite dramatic, and it's been the most dramatic at the very top. So the other average pay of 100 CEOs with higher remunerations, 1,000 here means 1,000 times the average salary. So if you look at the average salary in the U.S. economy as a whole, this log scale suggests that in 1975, the top 10 CEOs made about 50 times the average salary in the economy, but that by 2000, that was more than 1,000 times the average salary. The tax revolt of the upper class, U.S. tax rates for higher and lower brackets, 1913 to 2003. Here you can see highest bracket, lowest bracket. So this is the tax rate imposed on the wealthiest, the highest earners, tax rate imposed on the poorest, the people with the smallest incomes. And you can see that the rate goes up for everybody after the Depression, or through the Depression and World War II, but it is, at this point in time, an enormous gap. So 1965, at the top rank, it's above 90%. Down at the lowest bracket, it's less than 20%. It has not gone down significantly here, but for the very wealthiest, it has gone down in enormous steps, only coming back up, actually, in the Clinton years. But still significantly lower than it was in the middle of the 20th century. Real wages and productivity in the U.S., 1960 to 2000. This is a measurement here of productivity of the economy as a whole. This is real wages, so adjusted for inflation, 1960 in dollars per hour. So real wages peaked in 1973, if you adjust for inflation, at $15.72 an hour. And since then, even as productivity has gone up, which in theory ought to enable a higher wage for everybody in the economy, the real wages have declined, again, only coming up slightly in the late Clinton years. They have stagnated since then. So Harvey summarizes neoliberalism, or coins a new term for what's going on in the present time, which he calls accumulation by dispossession. And here he's being inspired not only by events in Iraq, where that dispossession is actually achieved by military force, but events in places like Jamaica or Mexico or other places. We'll read more about this in Davis. Structural adjustment programs in which dispossession occurs by the devaluation of a currency, for example, or the dismantling of a state sector that provided secure, high-wage jobs to large numbers of people in fields like education or healthcare, that kind of thing. The dismantling of those things under the dictates of the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, well, it's usually the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. He breaks this down into privatization and commodification, financialization, the management and manipulation of crises, and state redistributions. These are key components or arenas in which this accumulation by dispossession takes place. Okay, how much time have I got left? Like 5 minutes, 10 minutes? 7 minutes. Okay. I don't think I have time to spell out what each of these mean right now, but we can come back to them. Perhaps we can talk about them during a section in relation to the movies. These are key aspects of both neoliberalism and globalization. Right? The freedom of capital to move across national boundaries and to operate anywhere it wishes in the world on essentially the same terms, or terms that are roughly equal. But, in theory, the World Trade Organization is about creating international trade rules that will be the same everywhere and that will enable competition to be unaffected by political considerations and to operate purely on a logic dictated by market price signals. Now I want to quickly talk about development, the third term in our trio for the lecture today. And this is, I just really want to get you to think about this term not simply as a kind of descriptor in which, well, everybody develops and everything somehow moves in the direction of fulfilling its destiny, so to speak, right? We talk about human development, childhood development. There's this notion that there's a path, there's a trajectory. And I want you to ask whether thinking about such a trajectory for economies as a whole or societies as a whole really makes sense, or what it takes to think that, what it would mean to think that. There's a huge sector in the world right now. Many of you may end up working in development. Development is a huge arena. Lots of money, lots of people, lots of things happen in the name of development. If you've been reading the newspapers, debates about dams in the Amazon in Brazil are described in terms of the need for Brazil to develop, right? The need to provide greater incomes, greater well-being, that kind of thing. Well, where does this term, this idea come from? We've hit this a little bit with respect to Bernstein already, right? It's an 18th century term in English, emerged with industrialization and various theories of human prehistory and civilizations. It's linked very tightly to the ideas in the 18th century that we were making progress in ways that had never been seen before. We were developing incredible new productive technologies. We were changing governments and creating the conditions in which progress would come to be more and more amazing than it ever had been before. Modern society in this picture was seen as kind of a culmination of history. Some people cast it as evolutionary progress by survival of the fittest, tapping into sort of social Darwinism or cultural Darwinism, right? Applied to both society and the economy. So it was about economic growth and technological innovation in production, but it was also about the associated cultural and social norms and institutions, things like the arts and education, science, knowledge, wealth, cities and architecture. This whole trajectory was summarized with the idea of development. It was broadly, and it is to this day, broadly understood in terms of health and well-being and social harmony as well as prosperity. I mean, there's a general recognition when we talk about development, we're not only talking about making more and more and more money. We're also talking about providing better healthcare, providing more education, better education, generally somehow moving up in this implied hierarchy of civilization and development. So it's a mix of GDP or income per capita, infant mortality, life expectancy, public health, education, et cetera. If anyone wants to talk about the level of development of a country, they'll talk about income and GDP, but they'll also talk about literacy, infant mortality, life expectancy, that kind of thing. So in this framework, it's not just about exchange value in a Marxian framework, it's also about use value. And there is a strong analogy between the individual and society, the idea that societies somehow go through a period of birth, adolescence, growth, maturation. They then arrive at something that we think of as being the logical or natural succession from an earlier stage to a fully developed one. Here's a conventional model that's frequently used. You start with a society that's principally agricultural. As agricultural productivity increases, you get surpluses that can be poured into industrial development. Industry will in turn generate more surpluses, which can then be poured into human resources such as education, and eventually arrive at a society dominated by a service economy. This is a model that you will probably recognize from England, from the United States. It's the idea that this has happened in those places, and it must be a trajectory, or it can be assumed to be a trajectory that will happen in other places as well. And this is sort of what development means. Economic output per sector. This is a map depicting the relative shares of agricultural industry and services in different parts of the world. And these are constructed in ways to try to illustrate the various points along this trajectory that you can be. So red means more than half of the economy is about services. And you can see that that's true of virtually all of Europe, the United States, much of South America, Australia, Japan, South Africa, and other countries in Africa as well. But it's the green countries where the economy is still dominated by agriculture that we tend to think of as the least developed. Anyway, last note. There is a risk of teleology in development, a risk of imposing a linear notion of progress on all societies as though they must all eventually follow the same trajectory and arrive at the same point. And that contains a number of assumptions that can be questioned and challenged. I think I'm out of time. We will see you on Thursday. Thank you.